Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The Negro Pilgrimage in America, chapters 9, 10, and 11, starting on page 152. We shall overcome someday.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
In 1963, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, a new vast wave of militancy swept across the United States. A Department of Justice study indicates that in one 12-week period, 1,412 separate civil rights demonstrations took place. Birmingham, Alabama was one of the main targets of protests, and Dr. King led demonstrations against what he called the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. The Birmingham protests became violent when more than 2,000 Negroes marched on the downtown section of the city, and the Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, ordered high-powered fire hoses and snarling police dogs used against the demonstrators. The atrocities spread. William Moore, a postal employee, was shot to death on an Alabama highway as he staged a one-man freedom walk. In Mississippi, NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers was assassinated as he entered his home. And in Birmingham, Alabama, 4 Negro girls were blown to pieces when their Sunday school was bombed. Later, the same day, 2 other youngsters were shot to death. The increased demonstrations and the accompanying violence of 1963 reached such intensity that President Kennedy decided new laws were needed to provide Negroes with a remedy other than street demonstrations. The president called the situation a moral crisis for America and asked Congress to enact a sweeping omnibus civil rights act aimed at lifting the Negro from legalized second-class citizenship. In 1963, the civil rights struggle reached its high point on August 28th when nearly 250,000 whites and Negroes participated in a march on Washington. Gathering at the Lincoln Memorial, the throng heard Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young, a labor leader, Philip Randolph, Coors, James Farmer, and others articulate the hopes and dreams of most Americans. But it was Dr. King who provided what was generally acclaimed the most moving statement of the Negro's hopes and aspirations. And this is from the I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Greetings, forecast. How are you tonight? On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, an assassin killed John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. The murder occurred in Dallas, Texas, but its impact was felt throughout the world. For leaders of the civil rights movement, it loomed as an especially tragic loss. But what Kennedy had sought to accomplish during his too brief term in the White House was taken up by President Johnson. Although Southern senators, many of whom had served with Johnson in the Senate, tried to kill the pending Civil Rights Act by a traditional filibuster, more responsible senators prevailed. On July 2nd, 1964, President Johnson signed the bill into operative law. The 1964 Civil Rights Act deals with a variety of public and private matters affecting Negro and white citizens. The law forbids racial discrimination in publicly owned and operated facilities and in most privately owned places of public accommodation, such as motels, restaurants, and movie theaters. The law gives the Attorney General of the United States authority to begin civil suits on behalf of victims of discrimination. The act forbids voting registrars from discriminating against qualified Negroes seeking to register and vote. In addition, the law created a commission to investigate allegedly racial discrimination by employers and labor unions. But while the time consuming procedures of Congress were producing this major civil rights legislation, contrary forces were not idle because they never sleep. From July to September of 1964, a series of apparently spontaneous but massive riots occurred in major cities in the North. The fatal shooting of a 15-year-old Negro schoolboy named James Powell by a New York City police lieutenant set off riots in Harlem and Brooklyn, Rochester, New York, New Jersey City, and Jersey. Dixmoor, Illinois, which is just outside Chicago, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, were all subjected to days and nights of attempted mob rule. Investigations that followed the riots indicated clearly that the rioters and looters included many youngsters who were out of work and caught up in the hot and desperate hopelessness that is symptomatic of the Black ghetto. New York City's then Mayor Robert F. Wagner described them as having no roots in the past and no hopes for the future. For all its truth, this is a very sad commentary for the mayor of our largest city to have made. There was one particularly brutal chapter in the 1964 civil rights year. 3 young civil rights workers, 2 whites and a Negro, were part of the Council of Federated Organizations, or COFO, summer project working in Mississippi. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner of New York, both white, and James Chaney, a Negro from Meridian, Mississippi, disappeared in mid-June. FBI agents discovered their burned and abandoned station wagon a few days later, but it was not until August that the FBI found the trio's decomposed bodies buried under an earthen dam on a remote farm. All three had been shot, and one physician who examined the bodies reported that Shaney had been mutilated, so they mutilated the black man. Approximately 22 white men were charged with taking part in the murders, but the charges brought by the federal government were restricted to civil rights violations because murder is not a federal offense unless committed on federal property. Most of the 22 men charged escaped any court action, and the case went down in history as another tragic event on the road to freedom. With the 1964 Civil Rights Act on the statute books, 1965 became a year of tactical change in the civil rights movement. Emphasis shifted from desegregating public facilities to political action, especially in the South. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. selected Selma, Alabama as the prime target because the city provided a classic example of a potential majority of eligible Negro voters who were prevented from voting by a white minority. Repeated attempts to get Negroes registered in Selma met with persistent frustration at the hands of local officials. Demonstrations availed nothing as the local sheriff, whose name was James Clark, made it plain that he intended to fill the city's jails with Negro demonstrators as fast as he could lay hands on them. Selma Public Safety Director William Baker took a more moderate stand, but Clark had the open support of Alabama's segregationist governor, George Wallace. The forecast says, if they bring up those two white boys one more time, not the author, but like Khalid Muhammad said, I don't know why they were there, and you don't know why they were there. Exactly. On Sunday, March 7th, several hundred Negroes tried to begin a protest march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, about 50 miles away. Mounted state police and Sheriff Clark's deputies unleashed a brutal attack on the Negroes. They used tear gas, bullwhips, cattle prods, and clubs against men, women, and children. The Negroes were beaten back. Fresh evidence of Alabama's interpretation of the Southern way of life. The Department of Justice entered the case and, with civil rights leaders, petitioned for an injunction against Alabama officials who had tried to prevent the march. Shortly before a federal judge ruled on the petitions, thousands of Negroes and whites began converging on Selma from every section of the country. Many of those who came to participate in this historic march were religious leaders, clergymen, and nuns. One of them, the Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian minister from Boston, Massachusetts, was attacked and beaten by four white men. He died a few days later. So, from this author's perspective, there's been just as much white blood shed as there has been black blood shed in the fight for civil rights. But that's not really true because nobody fights harder for your rights and for your autonomy and freedom than you do for yourself. So never let them trick you. They're just pulling out notable cases because when we read Mob Rule, we'll see just how many of us died on this road to freedom. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I urge every member of both parties, Americans of all religions and of all colors and from every section of the country to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet in a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord, and so it was a century ago at Appomattox. So at last week, and so it was last week in Selma. With those words, President Johnson began to address the Congress, and the American people on March 15, 1965. The events of Selma had gouged deep and searing scars in both the American conscience and the American image throughout the world. It was clearly a moment in history when courage and leadership of the highest order were required. Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, newly elected to a 4-year term and with a landslide mandate to boot, stood ready to exhibit courage and exercise moral leadership. After announcing that he would submit a voting rights bill to Congress, the president added that the new law will provide for citizens to be registered by officials of the United States government if the state officials refuse to register them. For the next few days, the Selma to Montgomery Freedom March occupied the world's attention. Whites and Negroes walked and sang their way along Highway 82 while federal troops and Alabama National Guardsmen kept watch. Journalists covering the event reported that the people who marched were firm in their hopes that what they were doing would somehow help to make America better. But the Selma to Montgomery March was to have a tragic postscript. Just a few hours after the march ended, Mrs. Viola Ruizo, a white Detroit housewife and mother, was shuttling some of the marchers back to Selma in her automobile. Suddenly and without warning, a car loaded with white men approached and gunshots rang out. Several slugs penetrated the woman's body and killed her because they will kill their own to protect what they perceive to be their way of life. The four killers were members of the Ku Klux Klan. An all white jury found them not guilty. The long, hot summer of 1965. In the long, hot summer of 1965, when riots were sweeping many cities throughout the nation, it was hard to predict where the next outburst would come. Negroes living in Los Angeles had for years been almost unanimous in their denunciations of racial policies there. It was not then a great surprise when the most widespread and violent riot in the history of the United States racked that city for several days in the summer of 1965. It began in the Negro ghetto of Los Angeles known as Watts. Watts is a 72 square mile area that houses 90% of Los Angeles 600 of Los Angeles County's 600,000 Negroes. It is a ghetto that has grown steadily since the migration of Negroes to Los Angeles from the South. In Watts, the streets are tree lined and the houses are primarily one or two family houses. But behind this facade, however, is the same poverty, discontent, and desperate hopelessness that is common to the slum ghettos of New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and other major urban areas. The same growing bitterness over the treatment of Negroes at the hands of politicians, educators, and police. The same feeling of being shut out from jobs and education, the same feeling of being forever pushed to the bottom of the heap. On Wednesday, August the 11th, 1965, at 7:45 p.m., the spark was ignited. Two highway patrol officers stopped a car and arrested its 21-year-old Negro driver, Marquette Fry, and his brother. The young Negro's mother soon arrived on the scene from their nearby home, and an argument developed between the Frys and the white police officers. Crowds grew around the scene, and the police failed to disperse them or to resolve quickly enough what had begun as a routine arrest for drunken driving. The crowd accused the police of using unnecessary force. As words were exchanged and the crowd continued to grow, tempers boiled over. Rocks were thrown, and some youths became more violent. When the police failed in their attempts to break up the crowd, it began moving sullenly through the streets. Soon it was clear that a full scale riot was on. The riot lasted 6 days from August 11th through August 16th. Entire blocks were burned and hundreds of stores were looted. Gun shops and pawn shops were raided for arms and ammunition. Anything that moved became a target, even airplanes. When the rioting was over, 35 people had been killed and hundreds had been injured. 28 of the dead were Negroes. Property damage in the 150 block exceeded $200 million. On March 14th of 1966, there was a new violence in Watts as the Macomb Commission appointed by the governor to investigate the August riots had warned they would be a mere curtain raiser for future violence unless a revolutionary attitude was adopted toward racial problems. So they were saying they needed to do things a different way. The problems in Watts were by no means solved, nor are the problems in other communities throughout the country. It is clear that continually temporizing our racial problems is an invitation to disaster. So we can't make these problems go away by either ignoring them or saying that these are just temporary problems. We actually have to find real solutions and come up with new and inventive ways to solve these problems. Chapter 10, The End of the Negro Pilgrimage. It is hard to say just when the Negro pilgrimage came to an end. Nobody can set the exact date or the hour, but when the hope and the expectation for the peaceful pursuit of the blessings of liberty began to fade into uncertainty, something beautiful and something vital died in America. That hope began to dim when the 89th Congress closed the books without any new civil rights legislation in 1965. In a sense, no new legislation was needed, for in theory, the laws we have are adequate to protect the rights of all American citizens. In practice, the laws discriminate, or they permit discrimination. A Black American may not always enjoy the privileges of an American who is white. Black and whites together, separate in stormy weather. The Negro pilgrimage is a journey of faith, faith in God, faith in the democratic process, and faith in the essential goodness, the social morality of American people. The steady, peaceful pursuit of the enjoyment of rights already implicit in their citizenship and in our basic Constitution symbolized the courageousness of American Blacks no less than than their patience and their commitment to peaceful social change. Their pilgrimage always welcomed the encouragement and participation of the white brother who placed his own life and fortune on the line for the Black man's cause and for the larger cause of justice in a democratic society. The Negro pilgrimage was a painful odyssey, and its accomplishments were notable. It is a reflection upon how tenuously we hold our commitments to the principles of democracy, that the gains that were made always needed to be reconfirmed in law, statute law. For most Americans, their constitutional rights and the constitutional rights of others are rather nebulous abstractions. New laws on the books, if they do no more than restate what is clearly stated in the Constitution, provide a present relevance for those who have forgotten what the law was and for those who need to have the law recognized and honored in the breach. That is why the failure of Congress to support with legislation the valiant struggles of American citizens for the freedom for freedom in America was a bitter and disillusioning experience. And that is why the freedom of all Americans is always in potential danger. We do not know the strengths, nor do we know the limitations of democracy because we have practiced it so seldom. In 1965 and 1966, the arena of civil rights protest shifted from the South to the great cities and pleasant suburbs of the North. When this happened, there was a noticeable falling away of support from whites who had been sympathetic to the movement because they didn't want these things happening in their backyard. Money to mount the demonstrations and protests was increasingly difficult to come by. In Chicago and Milwaukee and Cleveland and Rochester, all over the North, white hostility to the Black search for reasonable participation in the good life in America was quite pronounced and was as pronounced as it was in the South. White Americans in the North wanted their public schools kept white, just as they did in the South. They wanted Black people barred from buying houses in their neighborhoods. The lily white craft unions in New York and Philadelphia remained closed to Negro applicants, just as they had been in Birmingham and Jackson, Mississippi. The best paying jobs in the corporations, the banks, the airlines, and the communication media in the North had white specifications, however subliminal, just as they did in the South. Give me one moment. I'm having some technical difficulties here. The Yankee indignation at the unbridled savagery with which the South had met the peaceful protests of Martin Luther King Jr., James Farmer, and their followers turned to petulance when Black protests came to Boston, and mayhem when they tried to take freedom in Cicero. The Negro pilgrimage had gone too far. The civil rights movement ground to a halt. The Poor People's March on Washington would be the final effort to recapture the romance of Black and white together in search of the American dream for everybody. The poor people, Blacks and whites, and a few Indians for good measure, could not bring it off. Suddenly, the war in Vietnam claimed everybody's attention and everyone's energy. The cause of freedom at home would have to wait again. At that point, something died in America, something great, something vital. It died. Frustration laid hold on Black America and her convulsions shook the country. There was a progressive shift from a nonviolent Christian oriented ideology to a new, more pragmatic perspective: freedom now, by any means necessary. Not all Negroes were willing to abandon in nonviolence, but many did. The long, hot summer became a euphemism for riot. The Black ghettos of northern cities were put to the torch. Newark, Detroit, New York, Washington, and scores of others. White merchants lost their goods. Black residents were burned out. People were killed, almost all of them Black. Thousands were jailed. Hundreds were injured. The police, the National Guard, and the Army occupied the Black ghettos and patrolled the streets. Suddenly, there was hatred. Had always been fear. Black leadership was divided. Some leaders, like Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, called for sanity. The recognition of the Black minority needed the white majority to win its freedom, and that freedom could not be won by violence in the streets. Others, like Stokely Carmichael, urged a total commitment to Black power, a term which had been given a free and convenient interpretation by a wide spectrum of its devotees. Martin Luther King, whose commitment to love as an instrument of social change had won the world's acclaim, refused under the most extraordinary provocation to consider violence as an acceptable response to violence of others, or as an expedient to move society toward the recognition of basic human rights for Black Americans. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered in Memphis, Tennessee at the Lorraine Hotel. Martin Luther King was a dreamer, and his dream was that the America he loved so much would someday be able to accept the people he loved so much, and that Americans would be one people, one great people. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream was that the love would be the efficient cause, the instrument for bringing the true community into being in America. They killed Dr. King. Society has always killed its dreamers. But did they kill the dream? Is it the same dream that held the Negro pilgrimage together that sustained the Negro pilgrims against impossible odds on a 100-year search for freedom? Why did the dream have to die? The forecast says it was really the Black Power movement, the civil rights nonviolence ended where people fought back and was tired of nonviolence and they were doing damage. He act like we got slaughtered. Exactly. We didn't get slaughtered. We protected ourselves and we always have protected ourselves. I also think that his appeal to Dr. King's dream was that did we bury the man and continue the plan? Because Dr. King said, I believe I have integrated my people into a burning house. And at the point that he made that realization, I think he realized that he needed those deacons for defense on his side out, out front again. I think he realized some things, but he realized those things too late. Excuse me. A new ethnic spirit. American Negroes have often been criticized for not being like the Jews or like the Italians or like the Irish. We can never be like those people because at the end of the day, those are just different breeds of white people. We're not them. Well, we are Jews, but we're not Jewish. We're not Jewish. That's a whole nother conversation, but we are not any variety of white people. You cannot integrate blackness into whiteness. They have been told to stay with your own kind and pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps. Sometimes Negroes trying to escape the ghetto have been asked, if you don't want to be with Negroes, why should we want to be with you? Even Booker T. Washington advised his followers, let down your buckets where you are. Implicit in all these arguments is the suspicion that Black people secretly hate excuse me. Implicit in all of these arguments is the suspicion that Black people secretly hate themselves. I couldn't even get that out the first time. And that they want to escape into the white world. It is probable that most Black people have known self-hatred at one time or another. In a society that extols all that is associated with white people and ridicules whatever is associated with Black people, it is difficult to imagine that self-hatred could be avoided completely. That is the tragedy confronting all Black children, the lack of acceptable positive values with which with which to identify. The forecast says it was more riots in 67 before the Martin Luther King assassination than in 68 after he was killed. Um, I think that as far as our image, we have accepted this image of white beauty as the standard of beauty. They, whether it's the hair, the clothes, the body build, the shape, we have to get away from their standards and we have to accept and embrace our own standards of beauty and of acceptable behavior. Whatever is available to them is negated by overculture and regarded as improper, immoral, ugly, or of no account. Nevertheless, the desire to escape into the white world is not necessarily an attempt to escape from one's friends and associates or from one's own subculture. Yes, it is. It is an attempt to escape because as soon as people get a little bit of money, they go to the white suburbs and they are very proud to be the first Negro or Black person in their area. And they have to get away from that mindset and mentality that just because you get a little bit of money or a little bit of status, that you now need to go try to integrate into a white community. It is fundamentally an attempt to escape to opportunity and from oppression. The suggestion that the fortunes of the Afro Americans could be substantially improved by being like Euro Americans ignores a very crucial factor that is not ignored by any other at any other time. Namely, the Afro Americans are Black, the Euro Americans are white, and in America, color makes a critical difference. The life chances of the typical Black American are structured by the color of his skin and no amount of bootstrapping or being like the Irish or the Jewish or the Italians is going to significantly affect the consequences of that fact. Exactly. Those are just Irish Jews and Jewish people, Irish and Italians are just different types of white people. We're Black. And there's nothing that can change that fact. In 1968, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, after an exhaustive study, reported to President Johnson that America is a racist society. So that was in 1968, the report of the National Advisory Board on Civil Disorders after an exhaustive study. That means they looked at everything. Back then, they knew that this was a racist society. If that is true, the answer to our racial dilemma could seem to lie in changing behaviors and attitudes somewhere else other than in the Black community. Perhaps we should all be like the Jews, the Irish, and the Italians. It is undemocratic, of course, to require any ethnic group to be like anybody other than themselves. It is unrealistic to expect that they will or can or that they even want to. The potential greatness of America is her potential for tolerating and encouraging healthy subcultures while building a national culture to which every ethnic group contributes and which represents the cultural common denominator in which every American participates and finds his national identity. So they would like people to be American nationalists based on what he's saying. The Negro pilgrimage saw with Martin Luther King the mountaintop from a distance. It had run its logical course and, with the old tools and strategies, could go no further. The last mile between slavery and freedom is a mile the man who would be truly free has to walk alone with himself. Others may help break the chains. A man has to free himself. Freedom moves from the inside out, not from the outside in. One of the odd features about the Black experience in America has been the fact that the Negroes have never been a true ethnic group. They wanted to move from slavery to freedom, from Africans to Americans, without even being Afro Americans. If the challenge to be like the Jews or the Italians or the Irish is America's way of recommending the ethnic experience as a kind of cultural seasoning rather than an implied denigration of the Black experience itself, then America is a veritable nation of ethnic groups. Ought it ought to be heard. There is very good evidence that the ethnic process is institutionalized formula for transition in America. It has a conditioning effect upon the ethnic group and upon the overculture, preparing them, as it were, for each other. The contemporary Black Revolution is the overt expression of the Black man's discovery of himself and his ethnic group. He is not a Negro anymore. He is an Afro American or a Black American. In the rejection of the appellation Negro, he is trying desperately to communicate something more than a projection of his own self image. He wants to signify his newly discovered ethnic spirit. He is a Black man, not necessarily in color, but in affiliation. He belongs to a community of Black men, a Black subculture, yet he is American. Because despite the discrimination which limits his participation in the social process, he logically and properly belongs to and has made important contributions to the national culture. His subculture is Black American. His national culture, like his national political status, is American. Learning ethnicity is a new experience for the Black American. It means a reassessment of cultural priorities. It is not easy for Negro leaders and others who have spent a lifetime struggling to be accepted by white people and the white power structure to now be willing to defer acceptance while they learn how to be Black. Some Negroes will never learn how to be Black, nor is it reasonable to expect them to. But the options are not reduced to learning ethnicity or being accepted. The pertinent genius of an ethnic group is that it has built-in structures which provide for the psychological, if not the economic, security of its members who do not find full acceptance in the overculture. An ethnic group is literally a big family. It nurtures its own and provides appreciation and understanding until transition is accomplished. In the language of the Black Revolution, the ethnic spirit is expressed in soul, a conscious affinity for the Black experience, and an appreciation of all of its unique traditions, its travail, and its accomplishments. The new Blacks, the Black youth of the contemporary generation, have soul. They are proud to be Black, proud to be a part of the Black experience. They have discovered that Black is beautiful, and they want other Americans to have an appreciation of that fact. The new Blacks have demanded that the history and the art and the literature of the Black Americans be taught in the schools and colleges. It is a reasonable expectation. Black Americans helped this country be what it is. Its history is part of their history. Their history, their art, their literature are vital part of American culture. The academic curricula should reflect this fact when with becoming integrity. Americans, black and white, need broader, more realistic perspectives on the development of the country they share, and they must continue to share one nation, indivisible. The forecast says separate ourselves and create our own nation like the Jewish if we want to be like them. Exactly. If we want to be like Jewish people or Irish people or Italian people, we need to create our own institutions. That starts with schools, stores, church houses. That starts with businesses. That starts with all the institutions that uphold that community. So there's a brief chronology here when it talks about in 1492, Pedro Alonso Nino, navigator of the Nina, reaches the New World with Columbus. Negro explorers also figured prominently in the expeditions of Balboa, Cortez, Narvaez, and the Jesuit led French parties that explored Canada and the upper portions of the Mississippi River. And it goes all the way to, give me one moment. It goes all the way to 1970, no, 1966, where it talk 1968, where it talks about all of the different things that happened during the civil rights movement, but we've already talked about those things. So as you can see, the Negro pilgrimage in America has been a triumph of our a trying journey toward our personhood here in America. And at every point, we continue to fight back. We continue to stand up for our rights, even when they bought off our best thinkers, because they will pay and give our thinkers prestige like they did with Thurgood Marshall, giving him a Supreme Court justice position because he was one lawyer that was working for the benefit of Black people, and he kept winning cases. He kept winning cases. And so they said, let's get him on our side. Let's get him to think for us. So as you can see, they will pay our thinkers in an attempt to destroy and thwart our efforts at freedom. I'm not coming on tomorrow. Tomorrow's Friday, but I will be back on Monday, and I'll be reading Mob Rule in New Orleans by Ida B. Wells. Greetings, Forecast. How are you tonight?
I'm good. How you doing, Matron?
I'm good.
Yeah, I'm not gonna be long. I just wanted to hop on real quick because this was a real good book. It's like in my alley. With Thurgood Marshall, I always got a problem with him, but I ain't gonna go there today. But with the book at the end, the chronology part, is it long? Like this, like I'm not saying read it all now. I'm just curious if it's like saying like every event or just like major events.
It's only highlighting major events. It's highlighting the major events that he talked about. It doesn't list every event. It's about 10 pages long. Um, and it highlights aspects of the civil rights bill. It highlights when people became into office and things like the AFL-CIO. It highlights it doesn't highlight a lot of the killings, but it does highlight some of the killings, like the 4 little girls in Birmingham. It gives you a date. It gives you a date when some other marches and protests happened, but it 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 is not an exhaustive list, but it's about 10 pages worth of events.
Okay, okay, I see. Because one thing, because in this book right here, it was a lot of good information that I'm into. But one thing about a lot of the authors, especially back then, and a lot of the times they don't focus on like our successes, like when we win, like like I know is like the church slaughtering, but they don't talk about when like the Houston riot. They made a movie of it, but I don't really. But that was one of the times where black people supposedly killed them more, but it happened more than that. I'm just curious, like why a lot of them authors skip over a lot of that stuff, because I think that's information like we definitely want to know about, but
Yeah, I
yeah.
agree. I agree that we want to know that information, but I think that they believe that it would be detrimental to them getting published to put that information in books.
I
And
see.
they are, because C. Eric Lincoln was an academic. He was in the university setting. And when you're in a university setting, you oftentimes find yourself in a position where you have to placate a white power structure in order to get published. And so it white people do not want to hear about them being defeated by black people. He was an academic. He taught at Clark Atlanta for 11 years, and then he was an adjunct professor at Portland State University in Oregon, and some other places as well. But I think that he was trying to placate a white power structure in order to get published in America.
Oh yeah, that does make sense, because especially then when publishing it was like you got to go through them. Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, this was a great thing, because even he could have left out added about but anyway, that was a great book, a great reading, and this I definitely appreciate this one, the Negro Pilgrimage. I'm gonna have to buy it myself. So thank you for the reading and stuff, and I can't wait till the next one, Mob Rule. So
Yeah, we read Mob Rule on Monday.
yeah, that's gonna be a good one. So yeah, I
Yeah,
appreciate
well, thank you. I appreciate you for listening. I appreciate all your support. I value you more than you know. Um, I appreciate your broadcasts. You bring out points and thoughts that we don't have an opportunity to really think about because we're so busy moving, that we don't have a chance to stop and think about, wait a minute, why did they put that on the screen? Why did they popularize that story? What does it really mean? And why do we love white people so much?
it. Yeah, facts. Yeah, facts. So I thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot. Definitely coming from you. So I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you for coming up.
All right, peace, matron.
Peace. I want to shout out the forecast who was here. I know Anthony McPhail is listening. I know Boana Haguziki is listening. I know Koku is listening. I know Raw and the elders are listening. I know that the staff at the Daycare Ladies Network are listening. I know that the staff at Jesse's Kids are listening. I know that Oni from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. I know that Brother Bakari is listening. I know that KW Don 7 is listening. I know that Denial is listening. I know that so many others are listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. I will see you Monday, June the 3rd, 2024, and we will be reading Mob Rule in New Orleans by Ida B. Wells. I appreciate you guys. Peace.